So we'll be encountering all these new types of warfare that underlie the conflict that we're reading about between Shemshi-Adad, between Echad-Dunlim, Zimri-Lib, and Yesma-Adad. The city, as we'll see, is finally retaken after Shemshi-Adad dies. His charisma, his power, and maybe the weakness of his son here, his proto-empire begins to crumble, and we see that the Elamites, who of course were part of the cause of the fall of our Ur III state, end up coming, and there's an amassing of about 12,000 Elamite troops that end up taking Shubat and Leel, and end up taking Ashur, and it's during this power vacuum that Zimri-Lim, who was unable to come back to his home, come back to Mari, he takes advantage of this and returns to Mari and reestablishes himself there. So again, this period of Mari changing hands, it belongs to this native dynasty. Shemshi-Adad comes in, installs his son. Shemshi-Adad's empire and his son falls apart thanks to the Elamites, and then Zimri-Lim's able to come back. And we see all of this in a really interesting way at the site of Mari itself. Mari is a very important site, as we talked about. At the site itself, as you can see, again, an emphasis on defenses, its outer perimeter wall, possibly an inner perimeter wall to defend against siege, but this massive, massive complex, which is the palace at Mari. This is called, the name of this palace is literally the Great House, and we can see why that is. It's very, very big. It was excavated by the French in the 1930s. It covers about 6 acres of land. And as you can see here, it's very similar to palaces that we've seen before, but now on a vastly different level. Over 260 rooms on the ground level alone. And we know from the thickness of the walls that chances are there were many sections, right? Like for example here near the throne room and elsewhere, where we would have a second level as well. So very large. It was destroyed, as we'll come to see, but it's very well preserved for that reason, since it was burned to the ground. In places it survives up to 5 meters in height. Even in antiquity, this palace was incredibly unique and incredibly impressive. We have letters to Zimri-Lim from the king of Aleppo, who's relaying a request from the king of Ugarit. And the letter says, "Show me this fantastic palace of Zimri-Lim. I wish to see it. With this messenger, I'm sending a man so that I can know what it entails, what it's like." The palace was built thanks to this very brisk trade and Mari's position on the river, taking advantage of river traffic and then trade going from east to west. This trade in tin and textiles. And so it was a very, very wealthy site. So we've seen palaces before. What do we expect to find at a palace? We talked about a few of these attributes. We've seen them at Ebla. We've seen them at Tel Brak. You can see a few here. What are some of these attributes of a palace that we expect to find here? Anybody? Yeah.
Archives.
Yeah, okay, so archives, right? So in addition to our courtyards and our throne rooms, archives, these administrative centers, that's what a palace really is. And we have over 25,000 texts that come from the palace archives at Mari. Not just one archive, actually, 3 archives. And this is one of the largest archives that we have in the ancient Near East. It's fantastic in the sense that it relays a tremendous amount of information about daily life, palace operations, as well as internal administration. It's mostly records that record trade in textiles, fine wines, metals, these sorts of things. Again, this is the same period as the trade with Ashur and Anatolia and Kanesh. But over 4,000 of these letters are personal correspondence, correspondence that record the daily life and interactions and palace intrigue. We read about repairs that need to be made to the palace. We read about really bizarre gifts that are sent to the king. Lions that are trapped up on rooftops and packaged up in boxes and sent to Zimri-Lim. A horde of locusts that were sent by a local governor. This is very odd too, why you would package up a horde of locusts and ship them off to the king. It's very possible actually, and we think of locusts as being bad, but locusts of course are edible. So this might have been, this is true. When I was excavating in Yemen, actually, we had locusts flying nearby, and one of my workmen came up to play a trick on me. He holds his hand out like this, and I'm like, oh, because I thought he found something. He puts this squirming object in my hand, and and I screamed, of course. He laughed. Then he picked it up and started picking the legs and the wings off of it. And I thought, oh, it's really cruel. Why are you hurting this thing? He popped it into his mouth. And I was totally, you have these things where you feel like you're, centered, and then you get total culture shock. And then he offered me one. And actually, I hate to say I didn't have the courage to try it. But I'm told that it tastes like fish. So those are good. And actually, if you look now in Egypt, there's a plague in Egypt of locusts that are currently ravaging Egypt. So there are YouTube videos of these huge swarms of locusts blackening the skies. Anyway, locusts are edible. They're even kosher, as it turns out. So you can eat locusts, and perhaps that's why Zimri-Lim is receiving them from this local governor. Not all of these texts are good. We have texts, for example, that talk about sort of the problems associated with living in close proximity. You can imagine, right? Inside this massive palace, the numbers of people that were there. Zimri-Lim at one point writes to his wife, "I've been told that Nana has an infection. She's often at the palace, and I fear it will infect the many women there who are with her. Give strict orders. No one is to drink from the cup that she uses. No one is to sit on the seat that she takes. No one is to lie on the bed that she uses, lest she infect the many women that are with her. This is a very infectious disease." So palace life was not all cushy. And certainly these are some of the drawbacks of living in these massive cities at the time. Disease can be rampant. We also have letters from Zimri-Lim, but also from the previous period, from Yasma-Adad. Yasma-Adad, who writes a response to his father. We read one last time in which Shimshi-Adad wrote to his son saying, you're really, well, what's your problem? Why aren't you stepping up and ruling Mari like a true king? And he writes back, "Father, I've heard your letter to me with the following message in which you said to me, 'You there, how much longer must we care for you? Are you a child and not a man? Are there no whiskers on your chin? How much longer will you be unable to govern your house? Now then, am I supposed to be so young and unable to govern? But you yourself reared me and fixed my destiny by your very own order, and I'm supposed to now not either hold slave or rule my household. How come? Ever since childhood I grew up in your presence, and now the slaves begin to separate me for your affection. So I'm coming to you right now to have it out with you, Father, for I am very, very unhappy." This kind of whiny sort of sense that we get from these letters, and especially with the rejoinders from his brother saying, like, stop it, have some sense. Yasma-Adad appears to be perhaps maybe not a very effective ruler. But these texts that we have, these 25,000 texts, in addition to administrative texts, those official letters we talked about, we also see omen texts that are the result of the extispicy, right? The process of looking for omens, and they're actually written down on tablets shaped like livers. So you can see here these divinations, once the omen has been read, they're written down on a liver model. And it's actually, the liver is really important. It was actually thought at this time to be the seat of thought, that this is really where your thinking took place, as opposed to in your brain. The Egyptians felt it was the heart as opposed to the brain. But yeah, the liver is very important, and so for that reason, we see the focus on it, and then its use, right, with goats and sheep to tell the future. We'll actually look at this a little bit later too. There's a copy of that letter of Yasma-Adad to his father. So, what would it be like? What would it be like to come to this palace if you're one of these local governors and you have business with the king? How would you interact here? So we're going to take a look at some of these rooms in a little bit more depth. So you would approach the palace from this major entrance right here. You can see two large flanking towers defending the entrance of the palace, and this interim chamber perhaps manned by guards who would, of course, right, be limiting access to who's going to get access to different parts of this palace. Because again, this is an administrative center, it's a private residence, and also, right, it is it's also sacred in the sense that it's got shrines and religious sections as well. So the first thing that you would encounter is this massive court, biggest court in the palace, court 131. It was paved, but at the center there was a large section missing. So it was thought possibly that there was a pool in the center of this courtyard, or an area known as the Court of the Palms. We see this reference to the Court of the Palms in the Palace of Mari in texts over and over. So it's thought for a while that that was courtyard 131. Chances are it was actually this other courtyard, which we'll look at in a moment. The courtyard, after entering in through these three rooms, has a very curious and unusual room. This is room 132. And we're not exactly sure what this room is. It's approached by a series of steps, these semicircular steps that branch out. And you can see it doesn't have any other entrance or exit to it. So the interpretation, Mortgott's interpretation, is that it was a shrine of some kind that you would see upon entering the palace. We get a sense of what it would be like to be in this palace and the decorations that accompanied it. In that room, in room 132, there are a number of surviving paintings that were restored, and you can see them here with a very basic color scheme of black, white, red, and yellow. And 5 different friezes were reassembled here. And again, you're seeing iconography that looks very familiar. If we think about the depictions during the time of even Ur-Nammu and Gudea, this imagery of the king making libations before the gods, different gods, right? In this case, Ishtar. We've got Ishtar here. We know it's Ishtar for her long hair, but also the weapons, right? This mace head and these axes that are bristling out from the back of her shoulders. And another god here, a seated god, probably in this case Sin, with this crescent moon on top of his head. But right in our stele of Ur-Nammu, the same thing, right? Ur-Nammu wearing typical headdress, making libations before these gods. There are also some other scenes, these smaller subsidiary scenes with archers, possibly battles and tribute bearers, but again, very, very fragmentary. This dress with these flounced skirts, there's our comparison again with the stele of Ur-Nammu. I keep saying Ur-Nammu, it's Ur-Nama, but Ur-Nammu is another. If you read, Frankfurt, it's an earlier spelling, so forgive me for that. You can see the comparison in the way that these individuals are dressed. These flounced skirts, also in the stele of Ur-Nammu. So it's thought that this painting is one of the earliest ones in this palace. Remember, this palace was used for over 400 years, so it saw quite a bit of change and a changing of hands from the local dynasty to the Amorites, and then back to the local dynasty again. So again, we think that this wall, this painting is in room 132, probably dates to around 2000 BC. Let's keep on moving. Like Ebla, the courtyard had a number of rooms adjacent to it and a large archive adjacent to the courtyard. In fact, one of the largest of these 3 archives was in this central room right here between courtyard 106 and 131. That's where many of these texts were found. It's very possible these texts were from the upper levels too, and that when the city was burned to the ground, that these tablets fell and also were baked, which is very fortunate.